This is Karm, a solo project published and developed by Matthieu Gouby. Apologies if I pronounced his name wrong. Karm is a retro-inspired shooter and specifically feels Doom-inspired. Without the ability to jump, a character face that looks eerily like Doom Guy, and the fact that like Doom, Karm really doesn't have much of a story. In Karm, you play as a guy who's trying to destroy a Lovecraftian cult and the creature from beyond they have summoned. You tear through Doom-like levels slaying cultists and various cephalopod horrors. Karm was released into Steam Early Access in March of 2022 and is relatively unknown. It only has one playable episode right now, but it does have 2 more promised. I played through it taking my sweet time, and beating the first episode took me about 4 hours. Currently, Karm sits with positive reviews, with only 18 reviews on the page at the time of making this video, and 83% of those are favorable. I picked up Karm on sale, and admittedly it was because of its Lovecraftian vibe. I mean, I am the SaltyOctopus after all. Yet despite me being an octopus, let's look at Karm and discuss it with an unbiased opinion. Should this game remain unknown, or is it one that more people need to know about? Let's get into it. Karm is being built with Unreal Engine 4, and despite a modern engine, it does its best to capture the feel and vibe of the 90s shooters, with hand-drawn UI, simplistic low-poly level designs, and pixelated textures. Right out of the gates, I hate to say it, but I think Karm is a very ugly game. While I can appreciate what the developer is attempting to do with his textures, he missed the mark in my opinion. Most, if not all, of the textures are repeated tiles, but they're repeated at a small scale. There is also no fidelity around the edges of walkways or walls, with the repeated textures stretched across entire areas. The lighting is also very flat and dark, and to me, all of this made for a very dizzying experience, especially with the speed of the player character. There are also textures with a great amount of detail despite the pixelated style, and other textures with very little detail at all. This made for another inconsistent disconnect, and to put it bluntly, an ugly game to look at. In my opinion, if the textures were tiled at a larger resolution like in Doom, the detail and repetition would be much less impactful, thus making far less dizzying levels to look at. I also think the hand-drawn character could use some attention. While I can appreciate an attempt at copy and pasting the Doom Guy's face, it looks like an MS Paint version. I think a more original character design drawn with a little more detail could have been a much better choice here. Performance was relatively smooth. I play on an older computer right now with an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti, and I was able to get 120 frames in most areas. There were a few areas where my frames did dip below 90, and one level where I was struggling to maintain 30 frames for almost the entire thing. But other than that one level, I would say that the game performs fine. As for bugs, I'll give credit where credit's due. The game felt relatively bug-free. The audio of this game is fine, with the weapon sounds sounding exactly how weapons should sound. Nothing groundbreaking, but fitting for the game. What was interesting, however, was the game's music. A creepy and ethereal track can be heard throughout the entire game. However, as soon as combat starts, it ramps up to a heavy metal track. During the first few combat situations, I felt the music really set a great tone for the game. However, as I continued to play, the music got rather repetitive. The same 2 tracks are basically played the entire game, the soft background song and the heavy metal combat song. I would urge the developer to add more tracks for some variety to later builds if possible. Also, the heavy track starts no matter if the player is in combat with 1 enemy or 10. This created a few situations where I felt the heavy track was unnecessary, and while this is a nitpick, I think it is important to only use the heavy track for the biggest battles for immersion purposes. Another thing I really think could use some work between now and the final version is how the enemies evaporate when killed. I felt it was a bit of an odd choice for a boomer shooter type of game, but more importantly, it did not really read well when killing the enemies. In some instances, it was difficult to tell if an enemy had been killed or not, especially with the orange demon Cthulhu's. I learned way too late that this effect could be turned off in the menu, and in my opinion, it should just be defaulted to off. Combat feels like a Doom game, and I'm pretty sure that's exactly what the developer is going for with Karm. So for that, I have to applaud him. Circle strafing while clearing out hordes of enemies is standard boomer shooter fare. Levels are maze-like where the player has to press buttons and collect keys to make it to the end. With every button press or key moment, a host of enemies will teleport in almost every time. In Karm, we have all the standard enemy types. Enemies that throw stuff, enemies that charge, enemies that explode, and flying enemies too. too. The enemies are very generic and they do contribute to combat feeling a little mundane at times. In Doom, enemies can teleport in as well, but it's far more common for enemies to be waiting for the player to trigger them or waiting in monster closets that are activated. The approach in Karm is that the monsters are teleporting into combat 90% of the time. The effect of this is that combat becomes very predictable. Instead of running around a corner and bumping into a host of creatures, I click a button and know without a shadow of a doubt creatures will be teleporting in. However, overall, while the combat is pretty standard for this type of game, enemies can kill you very quickly in Karm, making it a little bit harder than the average boomer shooter in my opinion. The brutes can one-shot you at full health and they are very quick. They are the main threat in my opinion, and I also feel that there are not enough health pickups in this game, making certain areas needlessly difficult. I would like to see a balance pass with later builds of the game, either tone down the enemy damage or give us some more health items. A few other random critiques of Karm I have is that while I understand not having jumping, it just feels weird. Even if the levels are designed where the jumping is just not needed, I still feel like it belongs in this game. Even modern Doom engines have jumping in the game now. Another critique is that running into barrels makes them explode, and while I understand shooting barrels, of course that's standard video game knowledge, they should explode, but running into them should not make them explode. There is also a lack of feedback when killing enemies, and I think it would go a long way to have more sound effects when taking them out. Adding these sound effects and removing the strange evaporation effect I mentioned earlier will go a long way for readability. The final critique I will mention is the boss battle in the final stage of the first episode. Now, I am the first to admit I am a notorious boss battle hater in these types of games. In my opinion, on Karm's first boss battle is really negative. It was about as bland of a boss battle as I've ever seen. You have to kill a wave of enemies to then be allowed to do damage to a static boss that sits there and does nothing but soak up bullets. Once you do this, repeat the process 3 or 4 more times to finally kill the boss. The entire fight is tedious and there is almost not enough ammo to finish the event, and all of the enemies do a ton of damage, making it unnecessarily difficult. There are also cracks in the floor that are way too easy to fall into, forcing you to restart after dying in lava. While I always try to be supportive of solo developers putting their passion projects out there for the world to see, I still have to be honest as I pride myself on having journalistic integrity. Karm is not a standout game and I have a pretty neutral opinion on it. While the combat is decent enough for the 90s style shooter, the entire game is lacking in character and atmosphere or something original to make it stand out. It is not easy on the eyes at all with its repetitive and dizzying textures and a main character that looks like it was drawn in MS Paint. The excessive switch hitting, key collecting, and teleporting enemies make for predictable action and therefore a mediocre and repetitive game. And while Karm does do some things well, the developer has a long way to go to make this game really stand out in my opinion. With a base price of $13.99 and a promise to increase the price as they get closer to their 2024 release out of early access, I think money is better spent elsewhere. Karm is just not original enough or doing anything groundbreaking to warrant players buying it in my opinion. With so many of these boomer shooter games popping up, I think the money could be better spent elsewhere. So what do you guys think? Have you played Karm? Am I totally off base with my review, or do you agree with my assessment? Please let me know in the comments below. Please make sure to like this video if it was informative for you, and hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying my boomer shooter content. I appreciate you guys hanging out regardless, and thank you for watching. I'm SaltyOctopus, and I'll see you next time.